Thank you so much for the kind invitation. And I'm still actually processing Leilani's presentation. It's not so often that we get the chance to hear such a cogent and insightful analysis of this extraordinary challenge we're facing right now. And then she, without missing a beat, lays out a plan of action for, to take back and to move forward individually as well as on the policy domain. She's an extraordinary, we're so lucky to have her in her advocacy. So yes, my pitch today will certainly, her presentation will be a tad smaller in scope, but no less important. I don't have the same policy agenda. I'm actually hoping to, as Gordon has said, to discuss issues of care and what I think has been a missing link in the progressive agenda all too often historically and continuing today. And hopefully to segue into a bit of a discussion about policy alternatives that we're debating right now in the context of the Canadian election. So I think part of the discussion and segueing in the conversations from our presentations this morning and yesterday, but to say, like, what are the policy options on offer for Canadians right now in this election? What do they demonstrate? Are they going to get us where we need to go? Hoping that we can generate a bit of a discussion. We'll have Ellen and then follow up this afternoon with our keynote and the like. Very excited to be here. Very interested certainly to hear Dr. Kuttner's talk last night, and certainly gave us a broad overview of what we're up against, as did Leilani. Certainly the success of financial capital and rewriting the rules of global engagement, facilitating the catastrophic rise in inequality that John talked about this morning, narrowing the space for democratic states to act. He pointed, for instance, to the complicity of the Blair and Clinton administrations, which promised to modernize social democracy but stuck to the neoliberal script. And today, of course, we're looking at what might the alternative be to that, certainly some of which Leilani was talking about. The 1990s is an important reference point for me right now, one that I've been thinking about recently because I've been involved in preparing a shadow report to mark the 25th anniversary of the UN Conference on Women and the release of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Certainly, I see Janice Alton from Voice of Women in the room. This has been a really interesting opportunity for me to network with women's organizations across the country about how they feel or what they see, certainly on progress on a gender agenda over the last 5 years, but over the last 25 years, against against the rhetoric or something, what some might think or see to be some of the most significant advances that women have made. Certainly the conclusion that I've come to at the end of writing this report is that certainly, we are really not where we might have expected to be given the investment that we've put into this cause. Certainly after years of effort by the women's movement, organizations and the like, it's still something of an uphill battle. And moreover, I would argue that caregiving or the progress of women still really is a missing link in discussions of a progressive agenda. And certainly failure to actually adequately tackle the root causes of gender inequality in Canada and certainly globally will only serve to reproduce continued inequality, certainly for women, but more broadly. So I want to sort of talk about or look at some of the measures and where women have got in terms of progress, and then segue to, as I said, a broader policy discussion. Conscious of the time, some of that will mean maybe we'll pick it up in questions, but we'll see how it goes. And I should also warn Gordon, I don't have any way of understanding how the time, so you're going to have to haul me off the stage if it gets to that point.
Okay, hopefully it won't get to that.
So I think we can all point to here we go, it's just gonna, okay. We can all point to several really important changes that have happened certainly since the Second World War. Women's employment has increased dramatically. Birth control is now widely available. Abortion services are legal in Canada. Women have caught up and surpassed men in rates of post-secondary education. Many types and forms of gender discrimination are illegal now. We now actually, for instance, in a couple of provinces in the federal government have proactive pay equity legislation in place. We have a gender equal cabinet. We actually now have new gender budgeting legislation that was passed this past December. But, you know, in truth, change has been uneven and affecting some groups of women more notably and more markedly than others, and some areas of life more markedly than others. Higher levels of education, for instance, have not been sufficient to overcome persistent discrimination in wages and employment. These are both key markers of women's economic security and autonomy. Canada's gender pay gap is one of the highest, or the highest in the OECD. We're actually 31st out of 36 countries, behind the European Union and the United States. Women working full-time in Canada still are only paid 82 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man earns. And the gap, of course, is even larger for racialized women and Indigenous women, who make 60% and 57% respectively of what non-racialized men earn. If those women, if those Indigenous and racialized women had been making the same salaries as their white, non-racialized male peers, their bank accounts and the Canadian economy would have been $43 billion wealthier in 2015. Clearly, several factors are at play here, explaining women's lack of economic progress. I've focused on the wage gap here, but there are other measures. And certainly coming back to really key things, such as the distribution of unpaid work, the concentration of men and women in different sectors of the economy, and the very organization of the labor market itself. On the issue of unpaid work, for instance, women's hours, as this chart shows from the 2015 Time Use Survey, that their hours, in sense, have not fallen even as their hours of paid work have increased. So we see here that women are putting in 4.1 hours of unpaid work a day, which is roughly the same amount of time they put in 20 years ago. But what's changed, of course, is that the hours they're now, this comes on top of a full day of work, or paid work, for the majority of women. If we actually take, and this was interesting, I didn't know this, if we take paid and unpaid work together, Canadian women actually have the highest total work burden of all women in the G7. One of the other reasons that the wage gap stubbornly persists, of course, is because we've made absolutely little to no progress in tackling occupational segregation. This wouldn't matter, of course, if men and women's work was equally valued, but it's not. Whereas, let's see, there we go, that's good, I could come to that. Whereas some so-called middle-class jobs in business and academia and the like have opened up, in traditional working-class jobs, they are almost as segregated as they were in the 1950s. What we've seen instead is women moving into higher status jobs within female-dominated occupations and industries, such as in healthcare and education. And certainly among those women actually who moved into male-dominated fields, they're concentrated in female-intensive subfields in those same occupations and industries. So many more women, of course, have doctorates, looking out at lots of props here, but they tend to, the actual fields where women are concentrated or studying haven't changed appreciably. CEOs, for instance, we see women in the C-suite now. My colleague David McDonald's done this work, but by and large, they're concentrated in legal services and HR. According to the last census, and this is a table from that, 56% of women were employed in the occupations involving the 5 C's. That's caring, clerical, catering, cashiering, and cleaning. This has changed little from 1987, when 59% of women were in those same occupations. And for men, it's changed a percentage point. No, effectively not at all. The last thing, I know I'm sort of hurtling through this, I'd like to note is that there continues to be a significant wage penalty attached to motherhood. So we see younger women entering the labor market at wages close to near equal to men, but with the first birth of their first child, they experience a significant drop in their earnings. Here we go. Some women actually never manage to work their way back up the income ladder. This data is for Canada. Over a woman's lifetime, mothers will experience an estimated 8% decrease in their earnings, even after taking differences in age, employment intensity, and education into account. The motherhood penalty is real and persistent. So after 25 years of talking about work-life balance, this really hasn't fundamentally changed this life-altering trade-off. Indeed, there are new ways of organizing work actually are exacerbating these old forms of inequality. So as just an example, I was really struck by a new study that was profiled in the Times not too long ago, where we're seeing that women, of course, have many more advanced degrees, but the jobs now that require those degrees in law and finance and the like have started to pay disproportionately more to the people that have around-the-clock availability. So the actual premium, the wage attached to like crazy hours is such that, so in a couple where you might have two people with equal career prospects, it doesn't make a whit of sense, and looking at having a family, I mean, that sort of structure will necessarily involve women stepping back to taking on care. Typically women say, in fact, you're starting to see the reduction in certain among educated women falling labor force rates in the States, certainly, and I'm not sure what that pattern we'll see that here in Canada. So these are examples, different examples, but it comes back to care and the unequal division of labor. Certainly Mario was talking about the missing link, the missing piece. Leilani was talking about housing. Caregiving is fundamental, and how we can hope to understand how to proceed without tackling this fundamental disparity that is undermining women's economic security. I don't think it's particularly surprising that we have an economic system that's designed to exploit and extract profit, that it necessarily purposefully divides and exploits people. So I think gender equality certainly is not the only factor contributing to inequality in Canada and around the world, but it is significant and distinct. Examining inequality through a gendered lens then helps us to understand how social factors determine who ends up where on the income and wealth spectrum, and it also suggests, or it also complicates the suggested solutions to growing inequality, revealing deep-seated gender biases. So in thinking about that, and I'm struck again by the weight of having looked at all of the information I viewed for the Beijing report, and sort of the remit of this conference to look about alternatives going forward, I guess my global argument is if we fail to understand the profound impact of gender disparity, and understand the dynamics undermining women's continued progress, which has stalled, more specifically the politics and economics of care, that we have no chance or hope to actually advance truly progressive alternatives. And I do think that the current, notwithstanding the gender budgeting legislation and the like, there are currently huge blind spots in current policy discussions on the progressive left on these matters. Certainly our support for caregiving, our policy responses to date have been wholly inadequate. Canada, for instance, has profound biases baked into the fiscal framework of the state. We have tax expenditures and tax policies that privilege unpaid care in the home and create incentives for women to leave paid employment to take on caregiving, but not yet the income policies on the other side that would actually provide an adequate benefit to them to do so, all in the name of supporting unpaid care. Actually, Kathleen Leahy, who many of you probably know from Queen's, has estimated that of the 27, these are for figures for 2018, of the $27.6 billion that we allocate through the tax system in supported paid and unpaid work, only 5% actually support women's paid care costs. It's an extraordinary discrepancy. In fact, these figures in her analysis would suggest that Canada is unique and even worse in some ways the United States in terms of undermining women's economic security through the tax system. So I'm thinking my time is getting to the end, and I have a whole section on what we could do about it. So hopefully we could talk about policy discussions. Certainly, big piece of this in the current election, we're debating, and it's interesting, the choices that are on offer, that there are really distinct visions of family and gender equality and how best to support women and families on display. Distinctions between a program that conservatives are putting forward around cash for care policies and their utility, and of course the NDP, the Greens, and to a lesser extent the Liberals are talking much more about the importance of childcare, Pat, I see Pat Armstrong in the room, and of course she would tell you, home care, the like, that my argument would be the importance and critical importance of public services, and the foundation of universal services really is essential to moving any progressive agenda, certainly any gender equality agenda, forward. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we can pick this up in the specifics in the discussion. Thank you.